the only 24-hour radio news center in Kansas, I'm Gordon Basham with the 2 o'clock report. 30 years have gone by since the serial killer calling himself BTK took the life of his first victim. Now, Wichita police say they've solved the case with the arrest of a 59-year-old Park City man.
Today is a very historic day. The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
People in Wichita had been terrorized by the concept of this bind, torture, kill individual for 30 years, from 74 to 2005.
It is without doubt the most unusual case we've ever had here in Wichita.
I thought this is a master criminal. I mean, he's eluded hundreds of investigators over the years.
The man accused of being the BTK serial killer returns to a Kansas courtroom this morning.
Everybody wanted to know what this guy was about, who this guy was, and more important, how he could kill 10 people, including 2 children.
The hope is some of the burning questions people here are asking may be answered soon by Rader himself.
Mr. Rader, I need to find out more information.
Well, I mean, I strangled Mrs. Otero, and she went out, or passed out. I thought she was dead. She passed out. Then I strangled Josephine.
It was so quiet in that courtroom, you could hear a fly landing on a piece of paper a mile away in there. Dennis Rader was in the center ring of a 3-ring circus, and the spotlight was on him. Because of his ego, he loved that, absolutely loved that.
At that point in time, strangled her for a death strangle at that time.
With your hand?
There was no regret. There was no, I feel bad for doing this.
What happened then?
Trying to find a place to hide her, hide the body.
Did you find a place?
Yes, I did.
You gotta be kidding me. I looked at this and I thought, that is what killed all these women?
To the car, put her in the trunk of the car.
When people watched the televised courtroom confession of Dennis Rader, they basically thought they knew the whole story. But for me, that was just a start.
Hello, you have a prepaid call from
Dennis L. Rader,
an inmate at
Kansas Department of Corrections.
To accept this call, press or say.
When you went before Judge Waller and he asked you to talk about the details of all the crimes, what were you thinking? What was that like for you?
Well, I guess I want to be truthful. I wanted to let people know what happened, and people were aghast that I would go like that. Whoa, it's like I was putting on a show or something.
Were you feeling anything when that was happening?
I just unloaded. Maybe it was a way of a pressure valve, I guess.
Okay.
Here I am, on the mountain.
I'm Dr. Catherine Ramsland, professor of forensic psychology. I've been corresponding with Dennis Rader for over 10 years to try to understand what led him to become one of the most notorious serial killers in America.
He really controlled Wichita during that time period.
Rader wanted you to know he was watching you. He was aware of you. He wants you to feel his eyes on you.
That's so frightening.
I think it's very important to understand how any given individual could become an extreme offender. Why do they make these life choices? What kinds of mental states do we see in these people?
The story isn't over because at this point, we still don't know, or at least I don't know, what caused Dennis Rader to become the monster that he did. I don't know. I'm not sure. Do you know?
I think I know.
What made you so sick, you son of a bitch?
Dennis Rader is a monster. Dennis Rader is the worst of humanity. I don't want the story to go away until we find out why. Why did he decide that his life was going to be that of a killer?
This is the first time that Rader has explored these topics in depth with anyone. Why did you want to put your story out there?
The main thing is to help people like yourself understand a dark mind. You know, I lived a normal life. You gotta have a real dark mind. And that's $64,000 question. Why did I do that?
Each serial killer has a unique set of factors that turns him or her into monsters. The more information we have, the more we understand what makes them tick, the easier it will be to prevent them. Serial killers have interested me for about 30 years, and in part because when I was a kid, there was a serial killer operating in my neighborhood before anyone even used the phrase serial killer. And my brother's friends found the first body on their farm.
An Eastern Michigan University student was charged today with one of the 7 co-ed murders in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area. John Collins, 22-year-old student at the University School of Education.
John Norman Collins is also known as the co-ed killer because co-eds from 2 different university campuses in the area were being picked up and murdered. It fascinated me to watch the development of this case in the newspapers, and I wanted to find out more about serial killers. Later in life, as I became a professor of forensic psychology, extreme offenders were something we knew very little about, and I wanted to contribute to that. I've published 68 books and have 4 more in the works. Not only do I write about serial killers, I'm constantly teaching, I do police trainings, I do a broad variety of activities, all surrounding my knowledge of extreme offenders. A lot of myths have cropped up about serial killers, so I especially want to study cases that show that these myths just don't work. And law enforcement needs to understand this so that they don't dismiss a potential suspect too soon.
Dr. Catherine Ramsland is one of the leading serial killer experts. She's helped us understand how we might notice certain behaviors at an early age, pick up on those behaviors, and get help for those behaviors before it's too late.
When Dennis Rader was finally caught and revealed to be this older guy, paunchy, balding guy, I was interested in the media response to him.
This is a man, a family man, who went home to his wife and 2 children every night.
Doctor, why were there no red flags? Why did nobody see this? He was a church leader, a family man, right there in the middle of the community.
You know, I'm amazed by that as well, that nobody was able to figure out that this guy had this secret life that he was hiding.
The media wanted a specific type of person to fit the mold of serial killer. But he'd been a family man, a churchgoer, he had a job. You know, he basically blasted all the FBI stereotypes out of the water. One of the reasons I wanted to work with him was to look at someone who appears to be an outlier and see what he teaches us. Because he's not unique. There are others who have been family men, churchgoers, seemingly normal people who have these thoughts and sometimes act on these thoughts. And so I think it's important for us to not just understand them, but also treat them before they become serial killers. My initial communications with Dennis Rader were kind of interesting. He liked the fact that I came in with credentials because it meant he was being taken seriously. But at the same time, he wanted to test me. He said he wanted me to solve some codes, and he liked working with codes. He began to send me cut-out pages from magazines and newspapers where he'd circle things and he'd make odd comments. At one point he said, I understand you're interested in recipes of the 3-layer kind. I thought that was strange because I actually don't cook, and especially 3-layer recipes, so I didn't really quite get what he meant. I put the whole alphabet down, A, B, C, D, E, F, and then I looked at each of the pieces of paper that had things circled or items in his letter that corresponded to the A, B, C, D letters, and wrote everything I could down. But then I began to see the things that he had circled, like beef, tangy, king, so there's K. And then it dawned on me what the 3-layer recipes were. BTK, for bind them, torture them, kill them. And so once I returned the code to him and said, okay, what's next? He recognized not that I had solved the code, but that I would play the game. So your fantasy life was more important to you than your real life, it sounds like.
Well, I guess in a degree it was. The fantasy world was always right there, you know, not very far away. I could switch gears and move into one and move out of the other very quickly.
There's a great value in understanding Dennis Rader and his motivations, the things that made him do what he did. If we have more people who are skilled at recognizing those aspects of a person that might lead them in a path of some criminal behavior, whether it be a serial killer or whatever, if they can intervene, I mean, think of the lives that they'll save.
I would love it that you could just get some of this stuff off your chest. Your health is declining, and I think it'd be really great for you to be able to just say what you need to say. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I think so.
People refer to Wichita as a big little small town. And a lot of people don't realize how big Wichita is. It's the biggest city, you know, in Kansas. And Wichita is just this very livable place with very friendly people.
It's a small town with small town values, neighborly people, right in the middle of the country.
Dennis Rader was raised primarily in Wichita and moved to the suburb of Park City when he got married. When I'm writing about any person, I want to see what they saw, smell what they smelled, feel the air. Where did he work? What kinds of travel routes did he use? It's almost as if I'm putting myself in their headspace. There's a psychology in it.
Well, good morning.
Hello, Dennis. I'm in Wichita. Haven't been here since 2016.
Oh.
You ready to go?
I guess so.
Okay. Dennis Rader is in El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He's in a cell by himself, apart from the general population in the prison, but he does have a phone that he can use.
Let me get a drink of water here.
Okay.
My mouth is awful dry. Nervous.
Okay. In order to produce the kind of book I wanted, I needed to get permission from family members of the victims who had formed a trust. Dennis Rader had signed over his life rights to the victim's family trust as part of a settlement. So Dennis Rader gets absolutely no profit from any of the work I do with him. So what's your cell like?
Well, basically it's a 12 by 8, concrete naturally.
The way to approach really any offender is to be non-judgmental. That's the first rule. You have to be able to listen to what they have to say, no matter what they have to say.
The concrete has cracked, and I look through that, and I look for figures. Mainly I look for eyes first, and that's what I usually spot, the eyes, and then I could probably draw hundreds and hundreds of those things off the floor. I call them the cave monsters.
But at the same time, you also must keep your goals in mind. You must set parameters and keep some respect in the process. Is that why you call yourself a cave monster?
Yeah, people call me a monster. I guess I am sort of a monster, but basically Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Hyde.
Rader loves to manipulate people. And I know, despite a long involvement with Dennis Rader, I could easily be used and exploited in some way. So yeah, I have to keep my guard up really all the time. Dennis Rader was 28 years old when he murdered 4 members of the Otero family. By all appearances, Dennis Rader was an average Joe, and he lived in Wichita his whole life except for the years from 1966 to 1970 when he served in the Air Force.
I met the Rader family before Dennis. We went to church together at Christ Lutheran. I remember Dennis coming back in '70 from the service. It was a big deal. All the people of the church who had been there for years knew him. So they were welcoming home and, you know, how you doing and where you going to work. We had an old basketball goal up. Dennis and his brothers would play. Dennis didn't like to lose. He was a little bit of a bully, arrogant, older, better, whatever, you know, those kind of things.
In 1970, Dennis Rader returned from the Air Force, and he's 25 years old. The world that Dennis Rader is coming back to, the Midwest, puts a big emphasis on family values, where what matters is going to church, getting a job, getting married, and raising a family. His parents wanted to introduce him to a girl at their church. He met her and got married pretty quickly. What were you anticipating when you thought about getting married? What were you anticipating being as a husband?
Well, I think the main thing I'm in is love. I was really in love with my wife, and I still am. I still have fond memories. But basically, I think like any man, we fall in love. We don't really have any other thoughts except you want to eventually, you know, marry that marries your person that you've met and falling in love with.
The question is commonly raised, can serial killers, can they ever really love someone? If a serial killer has what we call the brain of a psychopath, their emotions tend to be shallow, and their ability to process moral information is distorted. If Dennis Rader talks about loving someone, it could be that he really doesn't experience that very deeply. Rader got his dream job, as he would call it, at Cessna, building aircraft. But then a short time later, he lost the job. And this was a big failure for him. He couldn't figure out why he'd been laid off, and he also had the pressure of how he'd support his wife. You got a job at Cessna, which you loved, right? And then you were laid off. What was that like for you?
Oh, that was a tremendous blow to me. That was what really set me off on going to my first break-in. Back the day I got laid off.
But why would that? Why would getting laid off get you to the point where you want to break in someone's house?
I think I was just frustrated with the system. So I had an opportunity for that evening. And I just basically went on a prowl and broke into my first home.
When you talk about your organized offender, which if you look from Dennis Rader's perspective, most of what he did would fall into what we call an organized offender style. They plan, and he actually would execute practice sessions to see what it was like to break glass, go through a house he wasn't familiar with. Until he thought he was ready, he would try to get the timing down of his potential suspects, then use that to have a successful event.
That person wasn't involved in your layoff, why would you pick someone like that to take out your frustration on?
Basically, I wanted to do something, I guess, deviant. That was a way to relieve my frustration.
Did it work?
Oh, no, I got worse.
When he got fired, he was so angry that he wanted to do something destructive, to act out against society. And that meant breaking laws. And that made him feel better. It just gave him a sense of being powerful again. And he was ready to move forward with something far more serious and lethal.
I had started on this dark side a long time before that, and the volcano was finally starting to erupt.
In 1974, Wichita was just a large Midwestern city. About 250,000 people lived here. The main jobs here were agriculture and aviation. What we didn't have here is crime. We had the occasional burglaries and robberies, but the bad stuff happened on the east or west coast. It didn't happen in Wichita, Kansas.
We ended up in Wichita after my father had gotten out of the Air Force. He found a job here in Wichita at Cook Airfield. There was 5 of us kids in the family. I was the oldest. Josie was very artistic, creative. She wrote poetry, drew a lot of pictures. Joey was just like a little man. I mean, he was already a lady killer, good looking, totally athletic. My mom and dad had this relationship of unbelievable love. You know, he adored her. It's the kind of love you wish you could find. They lived together and they died together. He basically died looking in each other's eyes. In January of 1974, I was 15 years old. It had been snowing. It was the day of testing for school. I asked my dad to take me to school early that day so that I could get to that early study hall. And Danny and Carmen had to go with me because they were riding with him also. Took my tests, aced everything. I was walking home, walked over to the back gate, opened it up, and my dog Lucky was outside. And that was totally not normal. So I said, "Hey, Lucky, what are you doing out here, buddy?" I went to back door, opened it up, and I noticed that my mom's purse was on the stove, flipped up. So I yelled out, "Is anybody home?" One of my siblings yelled out, "Charlie, come back here. Mom and Dad are playing a bad trick on us." So I ran back down the hall. I looked and saw my mom laying on the bed. She was beat up. My dad had a belt around his neck. You could smell the death. You could smell the fear. You could smell to this day, I can smell fear. My heart just broke. It felt like somebody had ripped my chest wide open and pulled my heart out. I told Danny to get on the phone and call the police. He yelled that the phone was dead. So I told Danny to go next door and call the police.
Crime scene investigators and detectives from Wichita Police showed up, and the 3 older Otero children didn't know where their 11-year-old sister was and 9-year-old brother.
When police went through the house, they also found Joey Jr. dead in his bedroom and Josephine hanged from a pipe in the basement.
They took us to the police department. I asked for Joey and Josie. And finally, a police captain and a chaplain came up to me and said, "Charlie, we got to tell you that Joey and Josie were in the house." And once again, it felt like they'd ripped my heart out all over again.
Sorry.
The crime scene investigators noted that the thermostat had been turned extremely high.
I turned the temperature up in the house so that would mess up their body heat temperatures. I did things like that.
Rader would often take his ideas from true detective magazines or fiction about crimes. And so he had read, if you turn up the thermostat, it makes bodies decompose faster and foils the ability to determine the time of death.
The lack of items stolen would give you the indication that the motive behind these killings was not a home invasion. It was more for the sexual gratification.
The police, when they found 11-year-old Josephine partially clothed, there were semen on her and around her body.
DNA was not even on law enforcement radar in the 70s. And that's one of the remarkable things about this case is the way the Wichita Police Department original crime scene folks collected that evidence and maintained it so that it was not contaminated, so that it was available for DNA when DNA came along years later.
The Otero murders were the first taste of a maniac that we knew was loose somewhere in Wichita, somewhere in Kansas. We thought it was a one-off, a one-time deal. We were wrong.
We're on our way to what was once the Otero house, where Dennis Rader committed his first murders, 4 people in a single family.
Hi, Doctor.
Hello, how are you?
Pleasure to meet you.
You too. Can you tell me something about when you were here that
Sure.
day, what it was like?
We had no idea what was going on here at all. Detectives were running in and out, and no one would talk to me.
But you knew them.
I knew them.
And they
Yeah,
knew you.
I knew them,
Okay.
and I'd go up to them, and they'd say, "Can't talk now, busy." In 1974, I was the chief photographer for Cake TV. All the reporters there were trying to get the police department to say something. Finally, they said that 4 people had died in the house. Well, that was huge. 4 people dying in a house in Wichita, Kansas, that just didn't happen.
The bodies of Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, their daughter Josephine, and their son Joseph II were discovered in their East Wichita home. The victims had been bound, gagged, and strangled with a cord.
The investigators looked shaken, and it was basically from the children, what they saw and what had been done to the children. That would shake anybody.
Do you remember where you spotted her?
It's probably when I took my wife to work. This is the winter now, and there's a lot of ice and snow. A lot of times she didn't like to drive on that. I wasn't at work at that time. I was probably in that area where the Oteros lived, and then saw her and the kids go to school one day. So after, I thought, well, this might be it. My first fantasy victim would become real.
When I talked to Dennis Rader, he had targeted the wife, not the children. The children were just collateral damage. And he said it in such a matter-of-fact way that it was haunting.
Basically, I just focused on that all the time. I was up in the neighborhood. I'd check on that house, one thing after another.
What was your plan? What did you think you were going to do that day?
I had a barn that picked out northwest of Wichita that I was going to take her and kidnap her, probably hang her. This Otero are kind of messed up the whole formula. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he was. They have a fence all the way around. I hadn't looked over the side of the fence. All of a sudden, there's dog prints all over the place. Didn't think about that. But I had to do something. I was teed up too much. But about that time, I reached down, took my cutters, and cut the phone line.
He didn't know that Joseph Otero Sr. was not going to work. He also did not know they had a dog. All he's thinking about is he's picked them, he has a limited time frame in which to act, and now he must complete the plan. What we do know about psychopathic killers is that they tend to over-focus. So it's as if they're a train on a track that is not going to stop till it gets to its goal, no matter what.
As you talked to Dennis Rader, did you feel at any point that he was trying to manipulate you?
Always.
Yeah.
But I always knew that's how he operates.
You've researched all these serial killers. Do you have dreams?
I do not, in part, I think, because I do it clinically.
Do you compartmentalize?
I probably do.
That's just
yes.
what Rader said he did.
He actually has a better word for it, cubing. Rader's idea of cubing is that he's the cube with multiple sides that he can switch in and out at any given time for whatever is necessary, but he's still all these other things.
Remember the cube, you know, good guy, bad guy. Was a fairly good father and husband to my family. I worked at church, I worked at Scouts. Then there's the dark side of me, secret, and that's very strong.
After Rader had killed 4 people, he went home. He knew that he had to present himself to his wife as if everything was normal. So he pulled it together very quickly and managed to act as if it was just a regular day and nothing had happened. And in retrospect, she didn't see anything different about him. So he was able to cube very quickly.
We've been tracking it down. The dogs are...
Dennis Rader and other serial killers like him can present themselves in multiple ways, whatever works for their purposes, and have no real concern about any inconsistencies or contradictions, including moral judgments. And so, yes, he can say he feels shame or remorse, but that can all be erased immediately if he's trying to present the face of BTK, the infamous serial killer. Did you think you would do it again? Did you think it would, that's it, I'm done, it's out of my system? Or did you think
That was there for a while. I guess you call that the cold stage or whatever, and then it starts to build again.
Okay.
Probably just like a person on a drug. They take a drug and they're high for a while, and then it wears off, and then they're ready to go at it again.
It was horrible for people here in Wichita, which was pretty much a sleepy little town, to all of a sudden find that this major massacre of a family had happened right here in our community.
It was a huge story. Most people at that time thought it was a drug deal because no person in their right mind would kill a family. That didn't happen at all.
Quadruple homicides today are still rare, thankfully, but you can imagine how rare they were then, and then the kind of attention that that kind of a homicide garnered, and the public outrage and the public fear and the demands that those investigators felt when lead after lead after lead led them nowhere.
In 1974, no one in law enforcement was using the phrase serial killer. It would really end up being used later that decade and into the 1980s. But nobody really understood what serial murder was about, in particular, stranger murder.
Fear spread quickly in the community. People began looking over their shoulders. Doors and windows were locked tight. Gun sales skyrocketed. And the prevailing paranoia was not without good reason.
The Otero murders changed the life, I would think, of everybody in the city at that time. It did in our own household. We did not lock a door in our house until January of 74.
When we were talking to the police detectives over a series of days and we were starting to find out what's happened, it reminded me very much of the in cold blood murders in Holcomb, Kansas in the 50s. It reminded me of that because I had been at the hanging of Richard Hickok and Smith.
The Clutter family was killed by a couple of recently released prison inmates that had been falsely told that they had a safe full of money at this farm. The prison inmates decided to pull this home invasion, showed up, killed the family, the four that were present, in cold blood for just a small amount of money and a radio, transistor radio.
When news of the Clutter murders rocked Kansas, it made a deep impression on Rader. You did hear that on the radio when it happened.
Yes, I heard it. We were on our way to high school. I was 14, sophomore. I rode to school in one of my employer's daughters in a station wagon. I always had a crush on her, and I loved sitting in the front seat, and she always wore a skirt. And it was on the radio, and I heard that.
Dennis Rader was especially interested in the fact that they had been bound with rope before being killed, because he himself loved the feel of ropes around his waist, and also in his fantasies he would be using rope to bind his victims. So the fact that the Clutter family had been bound with rope appealed to him.
When they found out that they were tied up, that's what I wanted to do. That went back to the bondage thing.
After Rader murdered the Oteros, he took a radio as if to establish some link of solidarity to the Clutter killers, who also had taken a radio. Rader aspired to become a serial killer, so that meant he needed to study them in order to figure it out. I think most serial killers are not very creative or bright about what they're doing, and they do tend to read what other killers like themselves have done. And yet Rader, I think, took that to an extreme, whereas most of what he did or thought about had been done before by someone else. He really was not that creative. And in order to become the serial killer he aspired to be, after the Oteros, he had to kill again. After the Oteros, the Catherine Bright murder wasn't very long afterward. Didn't you think that was risky?
No, I think the objective was that house and her, and everything else seemed to not mean that much. But she played into some of the magazines I was seeing, criminals going after co-eds and this sort of thing. I saw her one day in her house. I thought, well, this might be all right. I mean, she's coming from somewhere at that time of the day, and I'm in between classes, so that's a possibility.
At this point, he was going about his life as a student at Wichita State University, and a husband, and hoping to start a family.
It takes a different type of mentality to commit a crime during daylight hours, more confidence, and the ability to blend in than it would to work under the cover of darkness. So that tells you a little bit about the mentality and the planning that was going into these crimes.
When you had picked out Catherine Bright, how long did you watch her before you decided to act?
I parked away and watched that address for a while to see whether that was constant. And yeah, she did come home in the afternoon. So I thought, well, all I have to do is break in and be waiting for her when she comes in. So it took probably about a month.
Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old girl who lived alone. She had a brother who was 19 who lived in Valley Center. One night he spent the night with his sister so they could go shopping the next morning, and they got up and they went shopping. A normal day at that point.
BTK prided himself on meticulous planning, or at least he thought he did. He knew who Catherine Bright was. He had monitored her for a while, but he was not expecting a brother. Well, the brother came in, and BTK had to do something with the brother because the brother was an immediate threat.
He tied me up, had me tie my sister up, and he separated us in separate bedrooms. And he came back in and was going to strangle me to death. And I broke loose the bonds he had me tied up with and jumped up and fought him for the gun. He jerked it away from me, and then he shot me the first time in the head. And I went down, and then he thought I was dead.
This was not in BTK's plan at all. He was there to kill Catherine Bright and to do all of the torturous things that he did to Catherine Bright. A brother, that wasn't in the plan.
So a second fight entails, he once again shoots him, thinks he's killed him, and goes back to attack Catherine once more time. And next thing he heard was the front door open and Kevin's running away. So he knew his time was limited. So he didn't get to do everything he wanted to do. He said he knew he had to kill her and just move on, so he stabbed her.
She panicked, and I just, out of sheer stupidness, I stabbed her. And I didn't like to use a knife, I really did.
But as soon as he had stabbed Catherine Bright, he realized this was not what he wanted to do. What he liked was to strangle people, to bind them and strangle them. Stabbing was not in the picture, and never again did he use it.
And then secondly, he ran out of the place. The door was wide open. I saw him running down the porch and heading out into the road. So it was just a total mess.
When did you first feel like you were a serial killer?
Probably after Catherine Bright.
When Dennis Rader, the serial killer known as BTK, started corresponding with me, one of the first things he said was that I should take a drive into the countryside around Wichita. He grew up on farms, and he wanted me to look at the barns and silos. They might look ordinary, but those were the places he had his first torture fantasies. He had this fantasy of he was going to build this silo of terror. And so he drew it. And inside were things like the wheel of death, where he would chain a victim to it. And there was a train along with a railroad track, because his fantasy was to tie girls to the track and have the train run over them. When did you think of a barn for the elaborate torture devices?
Back in grade school. That's when it first started. It happened when we were playing cowboys and Indians. We would tie each other up in a silo, and I got sexually excited when I was either tied up, or even better, when somebody else was tied up. Later on, I came up with my sexual fantasies about the silo.
One of the things that we know about sexually compelled serial killers like Dennis Rader is that they often have generated a fantasy life that's very vivid to them, usually starts quite young. Studying that would show me what motivates them to want to kill someone, but also to actually cross the line and do it.
Well, good morning.
Hello, Dennis. I'm Dr. Catherine Ramsland, professor of forensic psychology and the author of multiple books about extreme offenders like serial killers. I've been corresponding with Dennis Rader to try to understand what led him to become one of the most notorious serial killers in America. This is the first time that Rader has explored these topics in depth with anyone.
People call me a monster. I guess I am sort of a monster.
The more information we have about serial killers, the more we understand what makes them tick, the easier it will be to prevent them. My goal with Dennis Rader is to use his story to dissolve some of the stereotypes about serial killers so that we can better identify children who might be at risk for becoming adult offenders. To do that, we need to understand what motivates someone like Dennis Rader. So we need to look at their development, their fantasy life, and their crimes to understand it. By the fall of 1974, Rader had killed the Oteros, murdered Catherine Bright, attempted to kill her brother. And Rader has been going about business as usual as a young husband and a student taking classes at Wichita State.
Initially, the Bright murder was not associated with the Otero killings. There were not a lot of similarities in the method of killing. The strangulation that was used at the Otero house was different than what you found where Kathy was stabbed, and that's what resulted in her death.
At the crime scene at the Oteros, the telephone line was cut, and there had not been a sign of a struggle. And at the Bright scene, of course, there was a struggle as Kevin fought back, and they turned furniture over. And the phone in the bedroom had been unplugged, but Catherine Bright was found clutching a telephone receiver in her hand. She just wasn't able to make the call.
Because Catherine Bright's brother didn't die, he was able to give the police a little sketch.
Did you pay attention to the news coverage afterward?
Oh, yeah, very close. We paid a lot of attention to the newspapers and listened to the news and anything, any tips. They had a fairly good description of me that he gave to the police. I looked at that and I said, whoa, that's pretty close to the way I look.
One of the things Rader said to me was that he always had bad luck with his crimes because something always seemed to go wrong. And he always felt as if he were the victim. And it's because he sees his world from his point of view and no one else matters. Clearly, he has not thought of his victims as human beings at all. They belong to him and they're supposed to behave according to his fantasies. And when they don't, he's the victim in his mind.
After the Otero case and the Catherine Bright case, the newspaper makes a report that there were some people that had been arrested that were indicating they might have been involved in the Otero killings.
The one thing BTK likes more than anything else is publicity. So when suspects were in custody, not Dennis Rader, Rader was not happy about that. So Rader is thinking about, wait, I'm the guy. Where's the headline? I want to see the headline. And that ticked him off.
In October of 1974, a prominent newspaperman for the Wichita Eagle and Beacon received an anonymous telephone call telling him that there was a letter related to the Otero case on the second floor of the public library in an engineering textbook. Detective Bernie Drawatsky was assigned to go look for the letter, and he did find that. The letter started out with, I did this, I did it myself, I did it alone, so let's set this straight. And then he goes into a recitation of all four of the victims, what position they were found in, how they were killed, the types of bindings that were used, the types of knots that were used. Whoever wrote that had intimate knowledge of the crime scene or had committed the crime. At the end of the letter, he mentioned that the code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK.
What gave you that idea that you should have a name, and how did you come up with it?
I've been reading books like the Boston Strangler, and basically I did bind the people.
But other killers didn't name themselves.
No, they picked up by the media or the police. But I thought I'd be a little different. I'd go ahead and name my own name, be done with it.
One of the things that motivates Dennis Rader a lot is the need for attention. He wanted to be considered special. And other serial killers, he saw them as being famous. So I think he named himself because he saw the way those names generated attention, and he wanted to terrorize Wichita.
The letter in 1974 indicated that he intended to continue to kill. He said that he was occupied by a monster. He doesn't know what the monster is going to do, and that BTK doesn't have a choice in the victims, that the monster picks the victims. The decision was made by the command at that time. The letter should not be shared to the public because it was work product of the investigation.
The Eagle withheld the information from the public at the request of police and did not publicize that there was a serial killer. And, you know, police had convinced editors at the paper at that time in the 70s that it was, you know, you don't want to panic the public.
I had a tape recorder at that time, and I kept telling the tape recorder, why did I do this? What caused this? And I think that I finally figured out what I call the factor X made me do that.
When Dennis is trying to talk about factor X, he's saying, here's the big mystery. What is it that motivates me?
Factor X was kind of what one would consider to be the evil part of him. He was constantly daydreaming about how he can use sex to control others.
Factor X is an overall drive. Even today, if I see something on TV or a picture or start thinking about the old times and fantasy, I still get that feeling, you know, that sexual feeling. I really do. I can't, it's just still there.
He wants to say there's a factor X that's alive in me that will have its way, and there's not a lot I can do about that, as a way to slip responsibility for the decisions he made and the actions he took. Because it makes him seem larger than he actually is. If we can't figure him out, he's a much bigger person. But if he can be reduced to reasons for why he did it, he's no longer special.
I blamed it on the factor X. Just didn't all of a sudden decide, whoa, I'm going to go kill Leo Terrell. And just building and building. It built to it, kind of like a volcano.
When do you think that started for you?
It started all the way when I was young.
Let me take you back to your childhood. You haven't talked very much, even to me, about your father and your sense of your father.
Just a minute, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Oh, there's lunch.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
What do you have?
Bologna, they kind of warmed it up a little bit. I got some scrambled eggs, and I got a biscuit and some oil.
Dennis Rader thinks of himself as a good person who did some bad things. I don't buy that. But he certainly lives in an ordinary way most of the time. If anyone wanted to have an association with him, I mean, you have to talk about ordinary things that really aren't about serial murder. Well, I mean, feel free to eat while you're talking if you think you can do both. I don't want you to waste that. So let's go back to your childhood.
My dad was sort of my hero.
Okay.
He was a really good male model. He took us fishing, taught us how to hunt. He worked 2 jobs, moonlighting, and he was just a busy man.
Would you say you were close to him growing up then?
Yeah, I was closer probably him to Mom, but they were both good parents.
The common perception of a serial killer's childhood is that they inevitably have endured some form of physical, sexual, or verbal abuse, and pretty serious abuse. And we need to recognize that we're wrong about that, and we need to stretch our concept to accommodate somebody who didn't have child abuse. Dennis Rader was born in a small town in southeastern Kansas. Both grandparents had farms. There was prayer, Bible reading. It seemed as if he had basically an all-American boyhood. But Rader didn't mature beyond the childhood need for attention. And one of the things we do see in serial killers, especially those who have this psychopathic kind of nature is an arrested development. While he matured in other ways, this need for attention remained very infantile. When Rader was a boy, there was an incident that happened that he thinks of as a formative event.
My mom, she was vacuuming the living room, and under one of the sofas, she got the ring caught in one of the springs, and she couldn't reach it with her other hand because she was hurting, so she asked me to go for help. That image of her being in terror and kind of held is prolonged me into one of my dark side.
The expression on his mother's face was a part of Factor X. Watching his mother, who is typically in a more powerful position, be utterly helpless translates through his development later to be, that's the expression I want on the face of my victims.
As a child, there was a big progression in his sexual fantasy life that slowly escalated and became increasingly more deviant.
I did start to abuse farm cats. I built a box and I cut out the top of it just for a cat head. And then I'd get some milk. I'd wait till one would get in there, and I'd pull the string, and the box would drop over. So I'd stick its head up through the hole, and I had a noose for it.
I never knew that. Why did you like hanging cats?
There was some sexual excitement there to see them hung.
He did admit that he had tortured kittens, cats, when he was younger, and it seems that a lot of the serial killers prefer cats. What they will tell you is that it sounds like a female in distress when you torture a cat.
Why does he not see the immorality of his treatment, but also why does he relish it? He loved utter helplessness and desperation and needing him to decide to let them go. It would certainly be a training ground for what is coming for him in the future.
At a young age, one of the things he was really fixated with was bondage. And it led to his actually experimenting on himself.
My fifth grade teacher, she was a real dominating female, and she used to pick on weaklings like me. Well, anyway, she became my first fantasy victim. I would sneak out and do some window peeking, and so I'd catch her occasionally in her bedroom. That's where I had my first sexual outlet, and it wasn't normal because it wasn't with a female. It was me tying myself up in a hedgerow against the fence, and I had this weird feeling. And whoa, what was this? What happened? To create that again, I had to use bondage.
The rope has already become an arousal mechanism. Peeping on people has been something that has made him feel powerful. Now we put it together with a woman he wants to have power over quite specifically, and he ejaculates. This cements the paraphilia. A paraphilia is a trigger to arousal that is considered to be deviant, sometimes to the point where they can't get aroused in a normal way at all.
Over time, you start to need more to stimulate yourself, more to get excited. And the fantasy started to escalate even further to his wanting to carry it out on others.
We see these childhood fantasies come full circle in the Otero murders, where all 4 victims were tied up, strangled, or hanged like the cats. And he replicated in his victims the look of helplessness he'd seen on his mother's face when her hand was stuck in the sofa.
When Chief Lemonian took over the department in 1976, BTK really wasn't on anybody's immediate radar, because after 1974, we did not hear from BTK for about 2.5 years. At that point, that was enough time to go by that some of us speculated that perhaps he was in prison or he had been killed.
What authorities didn't know is that Rader was starting a family in the Park City suburb of Wichita. Dennis and his wife had their first child in 1975. Rader had gotten a job from a security company. In a way, it was like the perfect job.
Dennis was one of the supervisors who would come out and supervise the installation. I mean, how ironic is that?
Working at a security company enhanced his predatory activities. He developed more skills and understanding of how to enter a home and how to get past a security system.
I used to like to go to people's closets, mess around in their Chester drawers and stuff, and find nylon socks and panties and things of that nature. I would steal them. That was kind of exciting.
So no one ever caught you or complained that things were missing?
No, I was real careful.
While Rader's wife was home taking care of their newborn, he began to act on his fantasies again, and his new job allowed him to troll for victims.
He was always looking for victims, and he was always monitoring his victims' activities. He called them projects. And one of the things he kept repeating to me throughout the time I spent with him is, if you become my project and you have a routine, you're in trouble.
Once you knew who you were going to target, what did that feel like to you?
Well, it's kind of like the big game hunter, I guess you'd say. He's got the target, or he's got the animal in his sights and his gun. This is going to be it.
What made you so sick, you son of a bitch?
This is the neighborhood where Dennis Rader would roam around looking at the homes, going backyards, being a voyeur, looking for what he called projects. And what he really liked about this neighborhood was this was close to the interstate, where it was a quick getaway. For Rader, a project is an incident that Rader has planned where he has targeted a person against which he's going to commit a crime. He began to name them, like someone playing the piano was Project Piano. So whenever he wanted to think about a project, he had a label.
I think it just popped in my head one day. I had to come up with some kind of nickname. A lot of times you'll see them name on a boat, or the oil men, they always name their oil wells.
When we sort of back up on this and look at it psychologically, he's dehumanizing people. He can distance himself from them and what he's going to do with them. Any pain they feel, any loss to other people is of no consequence to him because they're projects. On March 17th, 1977, almost 3 years after he killed Catherine Bright, the pressure from his fantasies had been building, and Rader was ready to kill again. Rader had his eye on several different projects, potential projects. He dressed up in tweed and, nice shoes and a briefcase, which was his James Bond outfit because he liked to think of himself as a spy. When he came to the first project, Project Green, he knocked on the door and no one answered. And so he figured if one project didn't work out, there was another one down the street that he could try as well. He was dressed to kill. This is what he had in mind.
I was all geared up to do something, and it didn't happen at Project Green, where the girls were home. But I think I went to a couple other houses, knocked on the door. So I was in the mood.
Rader then moved on to a different project, Project Blackout, and again, no results. He did not want to let this day get wasted in his mind, and so he saw a little boy, and he thought, if there's a little boy here, he must have a mother at home.
So that was random, but the opportunity struck, and I already had the plan what I was going to do, and there was the opportunity, so I latched onto it.
In my mind, I was 5, but I was 6 years old. Just turned 6. My mom, she was sick in bed. Sent me block up the road for a can of soup, you know. And on my way back, man stops me, shows me a picture, woman and child. Asked me, did I know who it was? No, sir, I don't. About 15 minutes later, come knocking on our door. Opened it. There stood the same man. He pushed me out of the way, proceeded to come on in, pulled down the blind, turned off TV, reaches under, pulls out a gun. Well, from that point, he locked us in the bathroom, put his kids in there, put a blanket, a couple toys in there. Pushed the bed against the other door. There was a crack in the door, just enough where you can see out. I was looking through the door. Seen her tape her hands and her feet behind her back. And plastic bag over her head, rope tied around her neck. Laying face down. He left. I was ramming the bathroom door. I finally broke a hole in it. We got out. I ran around to Mom. Just a second. It's a image burned in my brain. It'll never go away.
Anytime you have a survivor who was approached by an offender, you do learn more about his MO, his approach, whether he was persistent or not. What kinds of things did he say? How did he pass himself off? Shirley had told the kids to calm down because she did not know she was in for murder that day. She might have said to the kid, keep screaming, the neighbors might hear you. She might have said that, except that he calmed her and assured her, if you just do what I say, it'll be over and I'll leave.
Dennis Rader was an unforgiving, unrelenting madman. And Steve, I've always felt very bad for him for what happened to him, because BTK just didn't kill his mother. BTK really killed him too.
My memory of my mom took over everything for a while. I didn't care what happened, didn't care where I went, didn't care if I died. Still, sometimes I wished I was dead.
At Shirley Bayan's home, there's no empathy whatsoever for the kids or even seeing them as human beings. Rader has a wife and a child at home, and yet he doesn't seem to have the same feelings about what these kids are going through as they're watching through this crack in the door as he's killing their mother. Having the children there in Shirley Bayan's house, did that bother you at all?
No, my objective was to her. Kind of like a World War II, you're flying a bomber, and you've got enemy aircraft shooting you down, but your main focus is to drop the bombs on what they want you to drop the bombs on. Nothing else mattered. She was my focus.
Weren't you worried about what might happen with them?
No. They were old enough to take care of themselves.
Rader was barely even aware of them, which is exactly how the brain of a psychopath works. They're very goal-oriented, and they're just going to keep going until they achieve it.
After the Vian murder, BTK was back on the radar of a number of people at WPD. Some officers speculated that Shirley Vian was a BTK victim because of the way she was tied. She was actually tied to the bed, not just tied up and placed on the bed. And there was some semen found in the immediate area of her body. Most of the cases, there was semen discovered either on or near the bodies, but it was not a rape. It wasn't discovered in the bodies.
I never raped a girl. Just one of those things I just didn't do. Felt it's just a little bit too far. I think even serial killers probably have some kind of taboo. Yeah, that was mine. I would not rape a female.
There's an odd thing about Dennis Rader in that he never seems to recognize that murder is the worst thing you can do. So when he talks about rape being too far, it's absurd. Because in his fantasies, he did rape them.
Shirley was found with a bag over her head, and the fact that the bag was tied shut with a nightgown just seemed to ring of BTK.
There were formal knots used, not just someone just making loops in a rope until it was secure. When you start looking at the symmetry of the tying and bindings, that's when the bizarre flavor of the sadomasochistic interaction with the victims was there. The bindings were not just for security, but they were for bondage gratification as well.
I use clove hitches on hands or on feet. Those are very hard knots to get undone. Basically, once that knot comes to its peak, there's no way you can get out of that. So that was probably my favorite knot, but the other one was tie a knot on the end of the line and make a slip knot.
Dennis Rader often experimented with different forms of binding and knots that allowed them to make certain movements or restrict them further. It's a part of the paraphilia. That was the feeling of power and control. And that was also a part of the fantasy.
Dennis Rader would take artifacts, like a lot of serial killers do, from the crime scenes, and he would take items from his victims to dress in and to use as articles in his autoerotic activities.
We had a pretty good feeling that if we find this guy, there'll be no doubt, because we'll find all his collection of things that he's stolen from these poor victims.
Do you ever think when you're in that cell about the possibility that you could one day face a firing squad? They don't have firing squads in Colorado, and I don't think that in any...
Rader idolized other serial killers and craved the recognition and attention they received. He wanted to be acknowledged as being like them. But Rader worried that Shirley Vian's kids had seen him. He wanted recognition for this crime, but he wanted to see what would happen. So he didn't immediately communicate with police or the media. How long had you been studying other serial killers?
Well, it started about when I was about 14. And I think part of it come from a guy in California who took pictures of the models.
Harvey Glattman, yeah.
That was pretty exciting to me.
Glattman was a serial killer from the 50s, known as the Lonely Heart Killer. He posed as a professional photographer in California, Los Angeles, and he would lure his victims by promising them that he could open the doors for a modeling career or profession. And he would get more sinister and the types of pictures he would take. So pictures of them in certain types of bondage, and eventually he'd take control of them. And in the pictures, you can see the female's reaction to the fear.
Rader wanted to replicate that expression in his victims, where they would look at him, recognize his complete power and control over them, because it would make him feel dominant and powerful. Serial killers tend to keep killing, but after the murder of Shirley Vian, Rader would go quiet again, but only until he spotted the perfect victim. It's December of 1977. Rader has murdered 6 people. He's gotten away with it. He's feeling cocky. He's made mistakes. He's had close calls. He wants the next one to be just right. When he came to this street, he saw a young woman outside who fit exactly what he was looking for. She was petite, young, blonde, Nancy Fox. He stalked her. He went to where she worked. He wanted to get her routine so he knew when she'd be home and when she wouldn't.
She'd taken a second job during the Christmas season, and that was at the mall. We'd go in and act like he was going to buy something, looking for gifts just to interact with her.
On December 8th, 1977, 9 months after the murder of Shirley Bayan, Dennis Rader came to Nancy Fox's house for the final time.
He had already broken in and was sitting inside when she walked through the door. When she realized he was sitting there, and she says, "What do you want?" And he told her that he always used the word strange dude. "I'm a strange dude, gonna do some stuff with you. If you cooperate, you'll be okay."
She was upset, but he let her have a cigarette. They sat and talked for a while. At one point, she then said, "Let's get this over with so I can call the police."
He learned that he needed to take control quickly, so he took her to the bedroom.
At this point, he begins to mentally torture her so that he can capture that terror on her face in exactly the way his adolescent fantasy had formed. You enjoyed the look of fear on your victim's face?
Well, yes, it's sort of a sexual arousement with Fox. Things went pretty smooth and everything, and although her face was down, it's just the idea that I had done it is all I needed. It's like my mom when her finger was caught in the couch. She was struggling.
As he was sitting astraddle of her, he leaned over and whispered in her ear, "I'm BTK, I'm a bad dude." That was the second scene where DNA was found, or the seminal stains that were eventually used for DNA, was on one of her nightgowns that was on the head of her bed.
After the incident, then I had time to quickly go through some of her stuff, and I took some of her nicer clothes, or slips and stockings and things of that nature, my tokens.
When he was telling us the story about killing Nancy Fox, he recalled with specificity the details of the murder, her pleas and her words and her fear. This man committed these things to memory, and he lived these things day after day in his fantasy world. Although he looked normal on the outside, it just gives you a glimpse of the monster that was living inside him.
Here I go home, and my wife's there, so I had to make up a story why it was running a little late. We were having car trouble at that time, so I just blamed it on the car.
With Nancy Fox having been in the house and seeing how very small it was very clear that he had picked a place where he could easily keep total control over the situation, because his ultimate goal was to get her to the point where she felt helpless, and there was no place for her to go, and that way he could enjoy his ultimate fantasy.
Rader said Nancy Fox was his favorite case because everything went the way he had orchestrated it.
Now he wanted some acknowledgement that BTK had killed again. So he called it in and listened for the news. Because this is his special murder, he wants something associated with it that he can cut out of the newspaper and keep as a token.
On a cold morning in December of 1977, the police dispatcher received an anonymous call.
Dispatcher? Yes, you will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? 843 South Pershing.
That's correct.
We have a homicide that occurred here at 843 South Pershing. We received a call about 8:20 from an individual that said there's a homicide and hung up the phone. And officers came out and we have checked, and we do have a young lady that is a victim of a homicide.
Was she shot or stabbed?
No, she appears to have been strangled this time.
The officers that I knew thought it was pretty arrogant of the killer to call.
Well, when I made the phone call about Fox thing had already happened, and there was nothing about it. And that's probably kind of like a cat and mouse thing. I went ahead and used the phone. Stupid. I was so afraid that someone would ID that and say, well, I know that voice. Well, that's Dennis Rader.
He made the call that had put him at risk in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were definitely times when he expected to be caught, yet when he went uncaught, it just confirms for him there must be something special about him, and it must be because he's smarter than the police.
He said that was the stupidest thing he ever did, was make that phone call, because now there was a vocal footprint of him that could give him away.
It's been over 3 years since he left the letter at the library about the Otero murders, and now he's craving publicity. And he'd murdered twice more. But police still haven't revealed there's a serial killer in Wichita. This keeps them in control of the narrative and drives BTK to the media.
I was on duty at Cape as the chief photographer. The receptionist out front called back, and I took the call, and she said, you know, I have an odd letter here. So took a look at it, and it was a letter talking about Nancy Fox, detailing several different things, but the chilling moment in that letter was the line, how many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper? BTK.
Executive producer Ron Lowen received the letter. He's with us today to give us the information. Ron?
Jack, the communication came in the form of a 2-page typewritten letter addressed to KAKE Channel 10. It was signed with the initials BTK. BTK claims to have strangled a total of 7 people, mostly women. He provided a list of his victims, beginning with the number 5.
During the newscast, the police chief walks into the studio, takes his seat, and we cut to Lemunion, and Lemunion picks up the story.
BTK has killed 7 people, Chief. What kind of leads do you have?
Well, very honestly, we have no solid leads at all. We have general leads, we have circumstantial evidence, we have absolutely nothing that will point us to any one particular individual.
Chief Lemunion made the decision that, in fairness to the public, he needed to warn them that there was a serial killer afoot in Wichita after all.
This guy is in our community, and he's killing our people.
When they finally announced that there was a serial killer on the loose in Wichita, what was that like for you?
That was a pretty big buzz, really. I mean, that's not saying this good, but wow, they finally recognized me. You know, I felt kind of cocky at that time, I guess you would say.
Dennis Rader loved the idea that he was a serial killer. It was the hottest aspect of his identity. And his need for attention would ultimately be his downfall.
The most important thing that everyone can do is certainly be aware that we do have a very serious problem.
That was like an atomic bomb going off in the city.
The whole city was turned upside down. There were 200,000 people here. It changed the lives of 200,000 people.
You're dealing with a person who is perverted, a person that is sick.
People were just terrified. Question for Wichita back then is how many more people are going to die?
After BTK was apprehended, detectives searched his office and his home and came up with a stash of Polaroids that looked as if there were male victims. And they asked him who his male victims were. and he didn't understand what they meant, and they mentioned these Polaroids. And then he said, oh, that's me.
I always had the tripod, and so I rigged that up, and lo and behold, I could take pictures of myself. And then what I had was a squeegee ball. Because basically you ran the cord over to your hand, and then somewhere I hid the ball when I was in my pictures, and I just squeezed that ball, and the Polaroid would click.
He would dress in slips and female underwear that he had stolen. He would wear a mask that had makeup on it, a wig.
I used the cross-dressing and tying myself up as a sexual fantasy, like I was the victim.
Rader told himself that acting out these fantasies helped him diminish the desire to kill somebody. But on the other hand, he's also completely immersed in what it's like to be a victim, feeling the ropes around him, wanting to do this to somebody. And the more he did that, the kind of ensured that he would act out again. Sexually compelled serial killers tend to get addicted to what they're doing. They tend not to have control over the addiction, but Rader did take breaks. He went 3 years. He went 5 years. So he stands apart from many of them in that it's more an identity thing. He wants to be a serial killer than that he can't help himself. Because he could help himself, and did. Through the work I've been doing with Dennis Rader, I'm hoping to dissolve some stereotypes to include outliers like him and show that we need to accommodate more data than we have in the past about serial killers.
The most important thing that everyone can do is certainly be aware that we do have a very serious problem.
When the announcement came out from the police that there was a serial killer in Wichita, Rader found that exciting. Finally, he had gotten some attention, even though they didn't know who it was. He enjoyed the idea that he was terrorizing the Wichita area.
The hunt began Friday when Cake received this letter from the man police say is the killer of 7 people over the past 4 years. He calls himself the BTK Strangler and promises to kill me.
I knew they would say something about it on TV. You know, BTK sent us a letter. That was an extremely big high, I can tell you that.
Why do you think you wanted this recognition?
Along my childhood, I've always felt like I was an underdog. And that, somewhere along the lines of getting a high of recognition, I think it's like the movie stars and stage people, they see the picture in a newspaper or a story about them. I think they get a rush on that.
Rader never grows up in terms of the attention he needs. It all goes back to that arrested development.
Of course, keep in mind you're not dealing with a, quote, normal criminal. Assuming that the person is still alive, that person is going to kill again.
When Chief Lemunium announced that we did, in fact, have a serial killer, people were frightened. It had changed the entire complexion of how people went about their daily routines in Wichita.
Police were just baffled. They didn't have an answer. Usually if somebody got murdered in Wichita, we had an answer pretty quick.
Saying Wichita and the term serial killer in the same sentence, I never thought I'd do that. And particularly terrifying for young women because are they going to be next? And that's what everybody thought. BTK messed with your mind. He was controlling the police department, he was controlling the news media, and he was controlling the public.
While Wichita is reeling in fright, Rader is going about his business, pursuing his degree in the administration of justice. While you were in school, you were also committing your own crimes. Were you listening for things that would help you?
Yes, I was very careful with the forensics. I made sure I didn't leave my fingerprints. I wore rubber gloves, ones that you use when you're washing dishes.
He learned a lot about how police investigated crimes, which helped him to know what to do, what to avoid. That subject matter just helped him to become a better predator. What did you want to do with your degree?
I tried for the Wichita Police Department, I tried for the Sheriff's Department, I tried for the Highway Patrol, and all three of them turned out.
Serial killers who are attracted to law enforcement know that a police officer is in position to know a lot about potential victims, and they can approach people with a sense of authority by flashing a badge and getting people to go walk away with them.
We not only read, of course, what he wrote, every piece of paper was examined, everything was looked at for evidence. Not one piece ever had a fingerprint, had a hair, had a fiber that could be identified. And to me, that's why he feels confident in sending these letters.
You would get these mailings and they would be in all kinds of bizarre shapes. I thought there might be something symbolic about what he was sending. It was just the fact he thought he might have touched it and he didn't want anyone to see his fingerprints.
Rader has an attitude that he is smarter than other people because he's more vigilant, he's more attuned, he watches people as a predator in ways that most people are not doing. So as he's also developing knowledge about law enforcement and investigation procedures and forensic practices, that's just increasing his sense of, now I know what to do and no one will be able to touch me. Studying that is very important to our understanding of serial killers, because if they really believe they are untouchable, that's where they'll make their mistake.
As my partner and I tried to puzzle out what we could do to advance the case, really the only thing that we knew of that he had created and touched, held, was the communications. Now, the letters were typewritten and then copied multiple times. In 1978, there was not a copy machine on everyone's desk. So we sent a detective to hand carry the evidence to Rochester and had Xerox work with the material for about a week.
They were able to trace one of those copies by looking at the fracture and scratch marks that were present on the plate that you laid the copying material on.
And they were able to trace the two copy machines back to public use copy machines, the kind where you just put a nickel in the slot and make a copy. One was in the basement of a building at Wichita State University, and the other one was on the second floor of the public library, actually where the first Otero letter was found. The one thing that we did not have before was that somehow this perpetrator had a connection to Wichita State.
One of the people that went to our church worked with Xerox. So he eventually figured out one of my original letters came from the copies from WSU. He was that sharp enough. That, whoa. After I found that out, whatever I copied, I didn't send that in. I went to different copies before I sent it in.
After you knew that they had traced your Xeroxing to Wichita State, did it scare you that they were closing in on you?
It did. I prepared for the police to come knocking on my door. There were times when I thought they were closing in, and I would move things around and kind of clean up a little bit. And I had hidey holes here or there.
Rader would keep these journals to describe what he was doing. He had his own drawings, plus he had various items for his hit kits. As these things piled up, he needed places to secure them against anyone finding them and figuring things out. So basically the items from both his murders and his fantasies went into these hidey holes.
I had some cabinets at home that I could hide stuff in. There was a shed. I had old barns I hid stuff in. And then I had hidey holes underneath the house, crawl space, and I had hidey holes up in the attic.
During my work with Dennis Rader, One of the things he made for me was a map of these hidey holes. The map itself indicates the various places around Wichita he would have gone to hide some things. Like he would find an abandoned piece of equipment that had sat there for months, so it looked like nobody was going back to it. So he might use that as a temporary stash. He buried a few things. It was important for him to have this rigidity, this regularity of the map, which is exactly the way he lived his life. And after 1979, BTK seemed to have vanished.
BTK all of a sudden just kind of disappeared from public eye. There were no murders that we knew of. Everything kind of died down and started to get back to normal in Wichita, Kansas.
You got Wichita all in a frenzy over a serial killer, and then you went quiet. What were you doing?
Well, Harry was born in 78.
Right.
Fatherhood was big for me at that time. And I graduated in 79, so there was another factor. I did not have time to do anything in the evenings.
When you ask an expert why a serial killer stops, they normally are going to tell you they die or they are in prison and can't have access to other victims. But he said he was always hunting. It just had to be perfect for him to decide to go forward with a hit.
He liked his family life, and he liked the idea that he was BTK and nobody knew.
Stalking and that stuff never completely stopped. Basically collecting detective magazines and sketches and slick cards and 3x5, that continued.
Dennis, he would get 3x5 index cards, and he would cut out pictures of models out of advertisements, and he would affix it to the card, and then on the back he would give her a name and characteristics, likes and dislikes, and then he would put a card in the seat beside him as he would ride around, and he would, you know, I'm spending the day with Sally or whoever. It was like he had a relationship.
He would talk dirty to this 3x5 card, the slick ad. Then before the family would get home, he would go get in the shower with his card and masturbate. That was his preferred means of sexual gratification. He said that's why you don't have more victims dead, because I enjoyed playing with myself as much as I enjoyed playing with others. Dennis Rader had the opportunity to travel the entire state of Kansas. And because he was traveling and living in motels, he said that gave him the opportunity to practice his bondage.
The only time I had to do anything would be out of town. That's when the motel parties started.
One of the things that Rader did to kind of compensate for the fact that he didn't have time for victims was come up with what he called motel parties. And the motel parties were autoerotic kinds of activities. He had dolls that he used to help facilitate his imagination, and he would experiment.
I'd work up a sexy frizzy by doing bondage. A lot of times I'd have pictures of the girls and go through that, lay them out, rearrange them, look at them, or bring things out from the hidey holes of my collection that I got from victims.
Rader often would take items from his victims' homes that he could then use to replicate what he had done to them, but in an autoerotic sort of scenario. So he might dress in a slip or pantyhose or underwear that he had taken and imagine what it must have been like for one of his victims to know that they were about to die.
I bought a nice big suitcase and had a lock on it. When I was packing up and ready to go out of town, I would take enough of those things with me. When Paula was at work and I had time off, I would wash all the stuff, clean it all up and try it out. And I started to be real careful I didn't leave anything in there. And then I'd hide that back in my regular closet.
Rader grew careless, and there were times when he would use the privacy of the home to do some of his autoerotic activities, dress himself in a woman's slip, maybe his wife's, put a noose around his neck. And at one point, his wife came home unexpectedly.
My wife caught me twice, and boy, she was really upset, and I was upset because I got caught. She just told me, this is it. You ever do this again, ever catch you, we're going to leave. They're going to take the kids. We're going to divorce you. I made sure that would never happen again.
I think the fact that Rader had put his marriage and his family and his whole life on the line when he was indulging in his autoerotic activities speaks to the addiction of it, but also his belief that he was really smarter than people, he was special, and he just wasn't going to get caught. There was a time where you thought about suicide.
Yeah, I put a 357 in my mouth. I just felt to a point where maybe it was the man upstairs or something with the family. I thought the time has come. I'm basically stalking somebody else. So I got another person I'm going to set up for. I need to end this because I'm going to take somebody's life again.
You put a loaded 357 in your mouth.
Yep. I was just in that mood to take my life.
And what did it feel like when you didn't pull the trigger and you put the gun down? Then what went through your mind?
I guess I chickened out. I just couldn't do it.
Well, it sounds like you gave it a lot of thought. Was that about having regrets and remorse?
That may be. I feel guilty to a degree. At one time, I was more religious than I am now. I thought, well, gosh, if indeed heaven does exist, what will my grandparents think of me while I'm doing all this? But my concept on religion right now is a lot different than it used to be.
Okay. I wouldn't call it remorse so much as just, how did my life get this way? Maybe I should end it before I do anything to anyone else. But I think those moments were pretty temporary.
The first thing you have to realize about psychopaths is they're wired different. They don't feel emotions the same way regular people do. The best way to describe a psychopath dealing with emotions like guilt or shame or remorse, which don't exist for them, is if emotions are color, they're colorblind. Regular people in the normal population, we can look at a traffic light and see red for stop, yellow for caution, green for go. A psychopath, they learn, okay, the light at the top means stop, the light in the middle means caution, the light at the bottom means green, but they don't see the colors. They're just following the norms and customs and laws in society, which, if you're a psychopath, don't apply to them.
Dennis had a number of jobs, which he was able to travel. He worked in a security company. After he lost that job, he worked for the Census Bureau. That let him go to other states where he had the opportunity and took the opportunity to at least watch for victims, sometimes stalk them, and even plan for doing something to them. In one town, he actually dug a grave for someone that he believed he was going to murder.
Is there a possibility that there could be more murders? The one thing that bothered me in reviewing the Otero files was it was difficult for me as a homicide investigator to grasp the idea that a person's first killing would be 4 members of a family. How do you control and commit 4 murders, and very calculated murders? I mean, bringing weapons with you, bringing the instruments of binding, everything, it just didn't seem plausible to me.
Because he did take out-of-state trips during a time period when he talked about the urge or factor X being very strong. I think it's possible there might be other victims. So if there are, I want to be the person he tells that to. Remember the dream you sent to me? I want to read that back to you and see if you have anything to say about it. Do you mind? Okay, so the dream was about a boxcar, and here's what you wrote. One end had an old-fashioned barber shop, like my grandpa Cook had. In my dream, I'm working on a letter to you, so it is spread out on the table. I get my call number for a haircut and realize there is too much stuff left out for eyes to see. So I walk back to put it into my black briefcase. Then the alarm clock goes off in my dream, and I'm trying to shut it off, and at the same time, 2 police officers come in. One taps me on the shoulder and says, "We know you did more than 10. Then I awake to find out the real alarm clock is buzzing away. I've always really wondered about that dream and what it meant, and it sounded like you meant some very dark things.
It does.
The dream suggests he's about to tell me something that the police already suspect, because there are 2 officers who come in, and it has to do with his darkest secrets that he might have been about to tell me and then decided not to. Saved by the bell, because the actual alarm was actually ringing and woke him up. This is a dream you had, and you wrote it to me. What do you think it means?
Yeah.
Could he be holding something back? Yeah. Serial killers often do, because one of the things they're motivated by is power and control. And if he has a little secret, a little dirty secret, that could be just the piece of power and control that he maintains, and he's got to have something.
You're clearly protecting secrets in this dream, and it is related to your BTK activities. I'm really curious about what else there is that you would want to tell me.
Well,
this dream is related to your BTK activities, and it is something that you're writing to me, but you don't want other people to find it.
I kind of recall a little bit about the writing that, but I sure don't recall all the detail. But basically, as I told the police, Ken is it.
Okay, well, let's continue this, thinking about this conversation. And if you do have things that you could write down, that would be great.
Okay, all right. I will do that for you. Okay.
His explanation for it is pretty superficial and deflective. And I think maybe he regrets sending it to me. Whenever Rader would decide somebody was going to be a victim, they immediately were dehumanized entirely. They became pawns in his game. They were projects. He doesn't think of victims as human beings. He doesn't think about the repercussions on their family members. Even today, it's still so difficult to get him to admit that they were human beings, and he caused a great deal of catastrophic trauma in the lives of all the people who knew and loved them. And that was certainly the case with Maureen Hedge. We're in a neighborhood of Park City, where Dennis Rader lived, on Independence Street. And just down the street was a neighbor named Maureen Hedge. She was a 53-year-old woman who lived alone, had no dog, seemed to have a male friend who came in and out but didn't live there.
I walk by one of the blocks or something like that. I just wave at her, say hi. She's usually out in the front yard, tending her flowers.
And then one day, when he was looking at his window and he saw her out there, he imagined his hands around her throat. At that point, Maureen Hedge became a project. And he had been dormant for 7 years. He hadn't done anything, and suddenly he decides not only does he need to kill her, but he's going to kill a neighbor.
Rader was a Cub Scout leader, and he used that to stalk victims and to kill victims when the opportunity would arise. He planned a night out with his Cub Scouts. Once he got them bedded down, he would drive to Park City.
He gets to Maureen Hedges' house, cuts the phone wire. Her car's in the driveway, but the house is dark. He broke in and realizes she's not home. Apparently she's out on a date. But then he hears a car door. He went into her closet in her bedroom and heard the two of them come in.
That was a long wait. I had to wait a long time in the closet. And I bet I spent an hour and a half in that closet before he left. But he left, and then she went to bed.
That's when Rader made his move. But what was interesting in this is he was going to change his signature behaviors, aside from cutting the phone line. He was going to take her body out.
His plan then was to take her to the church. He had keys to the church as a member of the governing body of that church. Took her to the basement, staged her in various positions, took photographs with his Polaroid, and then disposed of the body.
We start seeing these big changes in between his crimes. He's getting more emboldened, and in being more emboldened and more narcissistic, he's simultaneously getting more reckless, sloppy, and disorganized.
My name is David Zickel. I was a police officer for the city of Park City. April 28th, 1985, I was working the day shift. Early in the morning, I got a call to check the welfare of Maureen Hedge. She hadn't reported for work, and that was very unusual for her. When Maureen wasn't found in her house, we made a missing persons report on her. Then her car was found a few days later at a bowling alley in northeast Wichita, and everybody kind of figured that something foul had probably occurred.
The body was discovered here at 53rd Street North, just east of Webb Road, a bit west of the area that police had been searching all weekend for some clue to the disappearance of 53-year-old Maureen Hedge.
There wasn't any suspects right away, so when her phone line was cut, we thought that was very suspicious, but we didn't know for sure it was BTK or a copycat, but we did have that in the back of our head that, you know, BTK had never been captured and this could be something, but she wasn't left in the house. She was removed from it.
You think you could participate in church activities while at the same time harming other people?
Yes, I did.
Didn't it seem to violate what you believed?
I know people would say, wow, what you did with Mrs. Hedge in the church, you know, the house of God, doing something like that, terrible. But I hadn't had any, what I guess you would call real bondage-type pictures of a female.
You can argue all kinds of things about what's going on in his head, but practicality, I'm the president of the church, I've got keys to get in, I know when people are there. This is a pretty safe place where I'm not going to be seen or interrupted doing all of everything what I've got to do.
But when you first decided to use a room in the church to bring a body to dress, to take pictures of, did it seem weird? Like, why would you even think of using the church?
No, it was a way to get what I wanted done.
After Maureen Hedges' murder, BTK did not surface and claim responsibility for that.
The reason he did not communicate anything to police or any media was she was in his neighborhood. So the last thing he wanted to do was have police focused on his very street. But time passed, and again, no one suspected the killer was living among them. So Rader began planning his next murder.
Rader would drive through scouting or trolling for potential victims. And that's how he picked Vicki Wegerle. One day as he was driving by, he saw her come out of the house and she drew his interest.
That place was not what I call my typical casing. Those opportunities that I had to really look for my next victim was around lunchtime, and I would drive over there and eat, and then I'd watch her place from my car. I used my rust of the telephone man. I had the hard hat on and the little symbol I stuck on it, and some gear that looked like telephone gear, you know, in my hands.
He then went to Vicki Wegerle's house, talked his way in, that he needed to go look at her phone.
She was very, very nervous and was watching him like a hawk. Her baby was playing on the floor in the front room. She said her husband was going to be home at noon. And at one point, he was fiddling with the phone like he was working on it. And when she turned her head to check on the baby, he pounced on her.
Didn't you know that her husband was coming home?
She mentioned it, but I thought, well, she may be lying on that. That was a big risk. It really was the middle of the day, around noontime. So that was a big risk that my focus was on her.
When her husband came home and found the baby and not her, he was initially upset, you know, that what's Vicki doing? You know, thought she'd gone to the store and left the baby there. But then when he walked back in the bedroom and saw that there was some comforters that were kind of disarrayed, he said, I knew that Vicki wouldn't leave the house like that. So he searched a little further in, and that's when he found his wife tucked under the bed, kind of secreted under the bed.
By the time police got to Vicki Wegerle's house on West 13th, her heart had already stopped beating. She died within 15 minutes at Riverside Hospital. Her husband, Bill, supposedly found Vicki with a noose around her neck.
Whenever raiders targeted someone, the callousness just sets in. And anything that that particular victim is associated with goes along with it. It's really striking to me that Rader, as a family man, has absolutely no concern about young children in a home where he has targeted a victim.
At that time, the police accused her husband and just couldn't prove that it was him. They really thought that was him.
After they interviewed him, that went unsolved. Never in a million years did people tie it to BTK, had any idea. Police were investigating it as a random act, and it just basically never was solved.
Did you ever think about what it would be like for you if somebody entered your home and did something like that to your wife?
I would have stepped in and fought him for sure, doing everything possible to protect my wife or my kids.
But I mean, what if you found her dead, murdered? What would that have been like for you?
Oh, that would have been very upsetting. It's like revenge to come back on me.
When I asked him what would happen if he came home and found someone had murdered his wife, there's no sense of outrage or horror that somebody could have done this to his family. It's more resignation. Ah, well, karma. Instead of empathizing with his loved one's suffering, he's only able to see how their possible demise would affect him. Rader was in his mid-40s. By this time, he had accomplished 9 murders without anyone suspecting him at all.
Well, I was building, I guess, toward what I call the perfect murder.
This is a bridge near Sedgwick, which is north of Park City. And underneath here is where the 10th victim of Dennis Rader was found in 1991. She had been here approximately 10 days before someone from one of the farms came across the body.
Mom's name was Dolores, but people called her Dee. She was such a loving, giving person And that's how I want people to remember her. She's that star that shines a little extra bright because of what she was in this earth and what she endured to leave this earth. And I think that's really important.
Dolores Davis was the last victim of Dennis Rader. She became a project, as he called them. He was out in that area, saw her out in the yard, thought it would be pretty easy to get to her as a victim.
There was a Boy Scout, a winter camp out for 2 nights. So he had various ways he could say where he was going to be, so an alibi.
She had a date that evening, a dinner date, with her friend who she'd been seeing. They went back to her place early evening. He went home. As far as I know, she went to bed under normal circumstances at about 10 o'clock. And somewhere before midnight, he made his move.
He just took a cinder block and threw it through the patio glass.
She thought the car had run into her house because I broke the back door. And I thought to myself, what if she stepped out of that door with a shotgun?
He said, I'm on the run from the cops. I just need your car and some money. I'm going to tie you up to give me a head start so I get away from here before you call any authorities. And so he took her to the bedroom, tied her up. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, I'm BTK, I'm a bad dude.
A lot of people think it's the inflicting the pain they enjoy, but that's just a tool. The worry, the fear, the suffering, that's what he really enjoyed.
I'm sure then she knew she was doomed. I shudder to think about it. Killed her with her own pantyhose in her own bedroom. So just the terror is palpable.
He took her body to a location, country road, under a bridge. And there he posed her in different positions, took some pictures.
After Rader hid Dolores Davis's body, he went back to the scout camp and snuck back in. A missing persons report had been filed for Dolores Davis by her boyfriend the morning after she disappeared. When police saw her broken window and that a jewelry box was missing, they put out an all-points bulletin searching for a perpetrator. Rader sneaks out of the Boy Scout camp again the next night to go back to the body. It's still bound with the pantyhose and whatnot, but nobody has discovered it yet. On the way back to camp this time, Rader goes to a rest area to change his clothes back into his Boy Scout leader clothes. And when he's in the stall, a trooper comes in. Trooper says, a crime has happened. We're looking for people who just look out of place. Rader was worried because at this point he had the jewelry box in the car, and he knew if they asked to look in the trunk of the car, they would see those items that were clearly not his and would have then been related back to Dolores Davis.
I said it's all over. Lord, good Lord. My wife, my kids, and my family, friends are going to know all about it. Here I am caught like a rat in a trap.
So Rader talks about the Boy Scout camp nearby. I'm just here on my way back to it. Trooper says, okay, you're not the kind of person we're looking for. And Rader goes back to the Boy Scout camp and is not a suspect in this crime. Rader made him feel like, well, an ordinary guy like this who volunteers for the Boy Scouts couldn't possibly be the person we're looking for. If your job was to question everybody and look in their cars, then you do that even with somebody who volunteers for the Boy Scouts. If I were using this case to inform law enforcement, I would show how an officer in the case actually made an error that let Rader go free because he adhered to the stereotypes.
The enormity of what I was afraid had happened. Part of the frustration, the pain, was the fact that we knew so little. We had no witnesses. The car was clean of prints. There was nothing in the house. They had nothing to go on, really.
The police did consider that certainly Hedge and Davis were part of BTK. I think they even thought Wegerle might be. But there were a lot of differences. Why would there be so much time between number 9 and number 10? It didn't make any sense at the time.
What we didn't know is BTK was going to the store with us. He was eating popcorn at the movies with us. He was going to church with us. He was the guy next door.
I can't tell you when BTK reappeared how shocked everybody was.
When I was writing the book about Dennis Rader, the serial killer known as BTK, one of the things he wanted me to have to use to organize it was his project list, comprised of various people he had identified as potential victims. And that meant being very clear about when he attempted to kidnap somebody, when he stalked somebody and made contact.
There were a number of young women during that time who he had picked out, who were on his list, who he was going to murder.
I had like 55 projects. People were pretty close to meeting the hands of death. It didn't happen.
The list had the project name, the years, the dates, the location, all the details he could think of and fit onto this little chart. So it gives a lot of sense of his personality. He liked things organized, clear. He liked to follow rules because he wanted other people to follow rules. But that way he could then break the rules, but come back into a safe, organized world. Project 16 on the project list was known as Project Blackout.
My name is Cheryl Gilmore Sarkozy, and I'm a survivor of BTK, and his name for me was Project Blackout.
After the Dolores Davis murder, Rader slips back into a period of dormancy. He continues to look for projects, but he doesn't act out. What were you doing in those years when nothing was really happening?
Well, I was a good father, husband, raised my kids, did a lot of things for them, did a lot of things for the community. I worked at church, worked at Scouts.
Okay.
But if I wasn't real busy, then I would go out on my prowling and look for my next victim. They were basically projects.
Did you feel like you were in control of your urges then?
Yeah. So I could always fantasize or look for more victims. That was part of the excitement, is being able to do the hunts.
The planning for any sexually compelled serial killer is definitely part of the pleasure. And Dennis Rader is quite the organizer. In the project list, marked Project Blackout, Blackout refers to a bar near the campus of Wichita State University, where Rader would often go have a beer. Rader writes "girl at bar" and indicates the year 1977.
I was 26 years old at that time. One afternoon, a girlfriend and I decided to go to the Blackout bar. And I started talking to this man, and he told me that he was studying at the university. It had to do with like police work and law. The bar got raided and everybody was told to leave. And so
He was walking with me through the parking lot. I said, so, tell me, do you know if it's against the law in Kansas to commit suicide? And he said, it is against the law. And I said, well, that's a shame, because I think that anybody that wants to commit suicide should have that right. And he reached over and took my arm and he squeezed it and he said, oh, please don't say that. And I thought, what a kind man. By then I was at my car and I got in the car and left. He was really sort of a nondescript type of character. He wasn't someone that I gave a second thought to after that. But it turned out that that was Dennis Rader. That particular day, he had followed me home, and then he started stalking me.
So I have a report from a woman named Cheryl. She said she talked with you at the Blackout Lounge.
I used to go to that lounge. What I was trying to do was get more notches on my gun at that time. So I was in the mood. I had everything set, had my hit kit, had rope, tape. I had two guns, a couple of knives. I was going to do something. I was at the height of my eruption.
Cheryl Gilmore Sarkozy's neighbor was Dennis Rader's 6th murder victim, Shirley Vian, who he killed on March 17, 1977.
I gave him the main target, and that didn't work out, so it was, what's next? Shirley Vian. It was totally impromptu. I didn't know exactly who lived in that house because I followed her son home that time.
The day Shirley Vian was murdered, I had a 4-year-old son, and he had come to work with me that afternoon. When he and I got home, the whole neighborhood was filled with police cars. There was a knock on my door, and this policeman came in and he said, the woman a few doors down has been murdered, and her little boy has said he saw the man knock on your door. So we feel that you might have been the intended victim. I can't imagine why anybody would want to kill me. It was a horrifying time in my life. And I nailed all my windows shut. I couldn't sleep for months. Had I been home that day, it would have been me instead of Shirley Vian.
It certainly was possible that Rader would have had a number of other victims had things gone a little bit differently, had someone come home when he expected them to, had he figured out a routine of somebody in the right way. From the project list Rader shared with me, we can see that he continued stalking a number of people during the period of 1991 to 2005, but he just didn't succeed. At the same time, Rader worked as a Park City compliance officer, a job that once again gave him cover to stalk and troll in his own backyard.
The reporting parties of where the sheep were killed.
A compliance officer, this is like a law enforcement equivalent, which is your grass is overgrown, your dog is off the leash, your house needs painting. He could kind of lord it over people and actually could carry a gun as part of the job.
Did you like being a compliance officer?
Yeah, I did. It's pretty close to what I wanted to be. Like a police officer, stuff like that.
Serial killers who aspired to become cops typically had delusions of power.
As I recall, several citizens called and made complaints about his being strict or rude, confrontational, and that type of behavior.
As a compliance officer, he didn't like it if somebody did something he thought they shouldn't. So in his world, it was okay for him to break the rules, but he needed that safety of that regimented world, so everyone else around him had to stay within their lane.
January 2004 marked the 30th anniversary of Dennis Rader's first murders, the Otero family. It was 25 years since his last correspondence with police or the media, and it had been 13 years since he'd killed his last victim, Dolores Davis, although no one had yet linked BTK to her murder.
When you have anniversaries, news departments do stories on it. So it was on the front page that a guy was writing a book about BTK. Well, BTK did not like that. He is so arrogant that he wanted to tell his story.
I've always wanted to be out there a little bit, be known, let them people know that I was still around. They thought I was maybe died in prison or moved out of the area, or basically just passed away.
When Dennis Rader learned that an attorney wanted to write a book about the unsolved BTK crimes, and he was going to cover 7 victims, and Rader knew there were more, so he didn't want a book written that would be his legacy, that would really not get the story right.
My administrative assistant goes through the mail every day, and she had gotten a letter that had a photocopy of what appeared to be an old Polaroid. It looked like a woman's body on the floor and a copy of a woman's driver's license. The driver's license was Vicki Wegerle's. Her murder had never been tied to BTK.
Investigators believe the letter is from BTK because it has information about a 2-decade-old homicide linked to BTK that only the killer would know. BTK claims in the letter that Vicki Wegerle was his 8th victim.
No photographs had been taken of the victim at the scene by the police, by anybody, because Vicki Wegerle had been removed from the scene by an ambulance crew. So if there were any doubts in anybody's mind that this guy was the real thing, it stopped right there. It regenerated the fears of the citizenry there in Wichita. In your gut, you felt like, oh my God, whoever he is and wherever he lives, we got to stop this.
A letter received by Cake TV was turned over to us last Wednesday, and we are treating it as possibly being sent by BTK.
In 2004, after the reemergence of BTK, the Wichita Police Department, under the leadership of Kenny Landwehr, who was the homicide lieutenant at that time, formed a task force made up of Wichita police detectives, FBI agents, KBI agents. I mean, I said, we're going to get this guy. I don't care what it takes.
BTK is back because he wants to see his name in the paper. He wants to see him talked about on the television station.
BTK is communicating again.
BTK is back.
BTK.
BTK.
This is one of the most challenging cases that I've ever been involved with, and I find that the individual that is doing this would be very interesting to talk to.
Early on in the investigation, a couple of profilers from the FBI were brought in, and one of the greatest guidances that they provided was the creation of the communications that Kenny Landwehr would release in these various media events. It all looked fairly natural the way Kenny delivered it, but these were scripted for the intent and sole purpose of keeping BTK communicating. If we could keep him communicating, that was the key to catching him. Eventually, he would slip up.
When Ken Landwehr did a press conference about you, what was that like for you?
Well, that was pretty high. He finally came out and said, yeah, BTK still exists in our community, so be careful. I was having a field day with cat and mouse. That was having fun.
The strategy that Ken Landwehr adopted was to personalize this, to address whoever BTK was. The hope was that that would make the killer feel as if they were buddies which is exactly what did happen. Rader really enjoyed it. So what started as an attempt to control his story turned into this game with law enforcement that he thought they were having as much fun as he was.
He has communicated with us since the 70s, and it continues today.
Shortly after that, Cake TV got a letter that had one page, the BTK story, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4, went all through the chapters.
He suggests chapter names in talking about BTK. What killer does that? He wanted to give us a guide on how we cover him, basically.
But the scariest thing was the very last chapter was just a question. Will there be more? Taunting police and Wichita, who was going to be the next victim, scared us all to death.
Why did you decide to send the BTK story to the TV station?
I wanted the police or the general population to know that, yeah, there might be some more. You know, I mean, it's not right off the sunset. There might be some more.
We would get sent information. Obviously, we'd read it, we'd do a story about it, but immediately hand it over to the police department, hoping that maybe this will lead to his capture.
In May of 2004, Dennis Rader sent a word puzzle comprised of random letters and numbers to Cake TV. It was obviously a word search, and the idea was that in this puzzle there might be clues to his identity.
Our responsibility was to find the words in the word puzzle. One was victim, one was serviceman, one was ruse. So we were in the newsroom looking at this puzzle going, oh my gosh.
Hello, Susan.
So nice meeting you, Dr. Ramsland, and thank you so much for shedding light on these puzzles.
Well, he loved codes. That was his big thing. He loved codes and communicating through codes with just the idea of, now you have to figure me out. You have to be thinking of me. Why he chose these words, why some are backwards, some are forwards. What's this number, which actually should have that the 0 to it, because that's his address.
Oh, wait a minute. Where's his address?
6220. If you saw that an O, you wouldn't know that's a 0.
Exactly. First of all, we didn't know at the time, obviously,
of course,
that the 622 and then the 0 below
who would do that?
was his address.
Right.
Here it was here all the time. And then he puts address right down there.
But that's the cat and mouse nature of it. The fun of it is he's going to take some risk in order to have some delight over how confusing this is going to be, and then he'll see that you won't get it, so he'll feel superior.
Which I'm sure he did. He sent Cake TV most of the clues and the correspondence. Why do you think he sent it to Cake TV?
He knew he was going to get publicity if he sent this to Cake. Yeah. And he loved the station because he watched it as a kid. He loved you particularly.
I remember responding to one correspondence in particular where he said, I hope Susan's and Jeff's cold gets better. 2 nights before, I had just said on the air, Jeff and I have a cold, Jay. Can you give us some warm weather? Why do you think he did that?
Rader wanted you to know he was watching you. He was aware of you, alert to you, and he wants you to feel his eyes on you.
That's so frightening.
Definitely. I was wondering, because you were so attuned to media at that time, whether you ever considered a media person as a project.
Not really, although that would have been something else if I think Susan was really worried that maybe I was after her, but I really didn't have her as I didn't have any media people at all. We were just using them to get things done, and that was the main purpose.
He's having fun because he is watching this hit the news, be talked about on TV, but he forgets you are a serial killer. This cat and mouse game is about real people that you killed. You're acting as if the police are playing a game with you and everybody's having a good time at it. And that is not what's happening.
We were all concerned because we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if all of a sudden in the middle of the night, BTK was going to go show up in our bedroom.
Throughout 2004 until the beginning of 2005, Dennis Rader sent correspondence and items of evidence from his crimes to the media and police. He enjoyed the publicity, and he wanted to tell his story in his own way.
Cake received another message from BTK about a cereal box that he had deposited at a home improvement store. That wasn't that far from Cake TV.
We sent immediately detectives to Home Depot, and they looked, didn't see anything. Talked to all the employees about any packages they'd found.
Investigators posted a message in the employee lounges asking if anyone saw anything suspicious.
A guy came back from vacation and said, well, yeah, I found this cereal box in the back of my truck, and it said BTK bomb. Thought somebody was just messing with him. So he said, I just threw it in my burn barrel when I got home. Turns out that was the communication that Rader was referring to. So when we got the surveillance of the parking lot, that was our actual first sighting of what we believed was BTK delivering that package.
The video was blurry, and he's far from the camera, so police couldn't clearly see what he looked like. However, they did see that he was driving a dark-colored Jeep Cherokee. What about driving into the Home Depot parking lot? And you think they'd have a surveillance camera?
Well, where I did my incident where I put that stuff in the back of the pickup, there wasn't any cameras mounted on the light pole, so I knew if there was any cameras, they would be a distance. And I wouldn't be very distinguishing, mainly just a person.
Dennis Rader's gotten away with this for 30 years, so there's a narcissism. We actually call this narcissistic immunity. The immunity part is the sense that he's so special that no one can touch him. But the narcissistic immunity is kind of well-earned because I'm one of the few serial killers that they haven't identified and never will, in his mind.
He asked to communicate with law enforcement directly. He was trying to find a way to do that without giving himself away. And so one of the things he suggested was to use a floppy disk. So at one point, he sent a message through the media saying, can I communicate with you guys, and can we use a floppy disk, and you won't trace it. And then he specified, be honest.
If it was okay for Rader to send the floppy disk without being traced, he instructed the police to respond in code through an ad in the newspaper that said, Rex, it will be okay.
We thought it so ironic that a freaking serial killer wants us to be honest. Lieutenant Landwehr decided, and the FBI decided to go ahead and place the ad and see what happens.
And I wasn't really too nervous about it. I sent a lot of stuff to the mail and didn't have any feedback or any kickback from it. I guess I got confidence that they were sort of buddies or something, or friends. I kind of had a little bonding with Landwehr. I think I kind of bonded with him.
This letter is from BTK. And we
thought they were wanting to play cat and mouse with me, which they were, but I thought they would be truthful.
Rader had this kind of idealism he had developed ever since he was a Boy Scout in his hope to become a police officer. He had this kind of John Wayne thinking going on that, you know, they're upholding the law, so of course they're not going to lie to him.
He answered with the floppy disk.
The floppy, was it just a test file on it, or was there anything else on it?
No, that was it. This is just a test. I wanted to see if they would pick up on it or to get through okay. There wasn't anything beyond that. This is a test.
One of their IT guys there at the Wichita Police Department loaded it into his computer. He began pulling metadata files showing prior users of that disk. Immediately there was an indication that it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church up in Park City. Also the name Dennis appeared.
Real quick check, the president of that church was a guy named Lynn Rader. That was a huge break.
That was one of those moments where you were just ecstatic. We found an address in Park City and the race was on. We all wanted to get there.
As soon as they get the location where Dennis Rader lives, two of our detectives are on it, and there sets the type of vehicle that was used by BTK to deliver the package to Home Depot.
We wanted to just go knock doors down and go in and get him. The lieutenant said we don't have his DNA to confirm that this is in fact the BTK killer. We didn't arrest him at that point, but he was placed under surveillance 24/7 because the last thing we'd wanted was for him to go out and try to victimize somebody after we had already identified him.
With DNA testing, forensic scientists can link criminals to crime scenes, something that was unavailable to police when the BTK killer first terrorized Wichita, Kansas in the mid-70s.
We had DNA from the Otero case and several other cases. At this point, you've got DNA analysis. When BTK was leaving all that evidence behind, it was worthless. It couldn't be analyzed back then, but technology had caught up.
Were you worried about getting caught during this time, that they might trace something back to you?
Yeah, I was real careful with my fingerprints. I didn't even think about my semen. They would have had to save that, 30 years? But they also had a DNA sample from Fox, Hank Wagonly. She had some scrapings underneath her fingernail for me because we did fight.
We began to mull over the idea, how do we get his DNA? And I happened to notice that his daughter had gone to Kansas State University. Let's get a court order and see if they've got any records. Sure enough, they had records of her. The records indicated that she had had a pap smear. We're able to take possession of that sample. Then we began to wait for the analysis. I got a call that following Monday from the examiner, and she said, that sample you submitted, that person is the offspring of BTK. Those were words that I had waited and hoped we would hear eventually.
That's pretty definitive at that point. It was very exciting. I can only imagine for the Wichita guys who've been living this case every day and night for months and years, that had to feel incredible.
Following the findings of our forensic laboratory, number one on that priority was the arrest of Dennis Rader. There were a number of people in the arrest team, all of the task force, plus a couple of uniformed officers. We got word from the surveillance team that Dennis Rader, or BTK, was on the move. He was leaving his office and was likely headed home. And so we were set up along his route home. The decision was made that once he passes, a uniform car will execute a traffic stop on him. When the uniform car stopped Dennis Rader's truck, I had kind of beat feet as quickly as I could move up because Dennis was coming out of his door popped open fairly quickly. But before he was able to get out, I grabbed him and introduced him to the concrete. I was joined by several of my colleagues who had every kind of gun in the world pointed at him. They got him handcuffed and we stood him up. When he turned to me, we were maybe a foot apart, looking eye to eye. He looks at me and says, would you mind telling my wife I won't be home for lunch? I assume you know where I live. Just calm as calm can be. We escorted him back to the transport vehicle.
He stuck his head in the door. He says, well, hello, Mr. Landwehr. So that was all he said. Immediate recognition and knew who Kenny was. We scooted him in the car. I jumped in next to him and we took off for our interview location.
Let's talk about when you did get caught. It was a huge effort. What was that like to be in the middle of it?
They had helicopters and all kinds of stuff around. Anyway, when I pulled off to go down that side street, they were all lined up on the street, and I thought, what are they there for? Could it be me? And then as soon as they appeared in the mirror, I knew, oh. I couldn't figure out how they knew. I first thought they made the connection when I dropped off my floppy in a mailbox, and that's what really threw me, because how could they figure that with no cameras or anything?
Right.
So I thought I could get out of it. I talked to Mr. Landwehr. He said, you know why you're going downtown? And I said, I've got an idea. I think that tipped it off right there.
One of the things the FBI profiler that was interviewing him with Lieutenant Landwehr made him say, it was very specific. He said, tell us who you are. Tell us who you are, Dennis. And eventually he would say, I'm BTK.
During the initial interview process, Kenny Landwehr was in the room with Dennis Rader and laid the floppy disk on the table to get his reaction.
That's the way of the catching it. But my job was message the paper said.
Rex, it's okay.
Rex is okay.
Yeah, you're right.
I need to ask you.
Sure.
You like it?
Because I was trying to catch you.
When you asked them to tell you if the floppy could be traced, why did you trust them?
I like the scout oath, always be truthful. I just was trustful. But they had declared war on me, and wars are not nice things. I actually felt like they should have given me more respect, I guess, playing their cat and mouse game.
To this day, when Rader talks about that, he still can't believe the cops lied to him. He got a degree in administration of justice, and he would know that interrogators use lies all the time because they're trying to catch the bad guys. So there's an odd, childlike naivete at play here. How could you have ever betrayed me like that?
Dennis even felt, that since he wore a badge and uniform, that we were kind of in the same group, that we were all in the law enforcement world.
Why did you finally confess during the interrogation?
They talked about the DNA, so nowhere along the line was they going to be able to escape that. So that was the final link. I was caught, there wasn't anything else to do, to be honest.
Cooperated in all the cases, including the two that the county detectives had, which were the Dolores Davis and Maureen Hedge, who were disposed of in their territory, their jurisdiction.
For decades, it's been speculated BTK was responsible for more murders. The 1991 murder of Dolores Davis and the 1985 murder of Maureen Hedge.
When Dennis Rader was asked about the possibility of his family knowing that he was BTK, he did not feel that they ever had a clue.
On the day that Dennis Rader was arrested, Detective Kelly Otis and myself talked with his wife. She was, of course, in shock, in complete denial. Complete denial. She said, no. Said, you've made a horrible mistake. She was not going to believe this. Although she was putting on a brave face, you know that she had to be, her mind had to be just whirling and wondering and worrying and thinking back over their marriage. Is this a possibility?
One time I was spelling, I think I was writing something to the church or something, and I was using her computer, doing newsletters and back and forth. And she says, you spell just like BTK. I go, whoa. I said, yeah, I've always been bad on spelling.
He was manipulative enough to keep them in the dark. As much as I say sick to my stomach, I was sick to my heart. I don't know that the Dennis that I thought I knew exists.
I did interview his son. He said, we lived the perfect Leave It to Beaver life. He said, we went on vacations. Dad was involved in our sports and our activities. The church, we had great time at home. Except there's nothing. But the day he was arrested is basically the day he will mark forever as the day he died.
He was like my best friend that I walked the dog with, and I was very close to him. And so when the FBI showed up on my door, you know, February of 2005, like I told them they had the wrong guy. I tried to alibi him, and I was just fell into physical shock. My whole world just fell out under me.
When you were arrested, did it occur to you that people who looked up to you were, how they were going to feel about that?
Devastated. I can't believe that, you know. Wow, Dennis has been arrested. What happened? How? Yeah. You know, I'm sure that crossed their mind. I was very, very depressed on that, you know, that, well, first of all, I didn't think I was ever going to get arrested, so, you know, you just keep going and keep going, so didn't ever think that would ever happen.
He never thought he'd be caught, so he really didn't think about what it would be like for them to find out their father or their husband was a serial killer. So if you consider that love is being able to think about what benefits the loved one, then you would say Rader's love, whatever it means, does not run very deep.
Today is a very historic day. The bottom line, BTK is arrested.
The day Dennis Rader was arrested, I'm in a shopping center. I hadn't gone into work yet. My boss calls, and he goes, "We're almost positive BTK has been caught. You need to get into work right away." No lie. The whole room, the whole shopping center started spinning. The blood rushed from my head down to my toes, and I sat down and said, "I'm gonna faint." And then I started crying. I just cried and cried and cried, and I think I had much the same reaction as a lot of women in Wichita had. And that was such a sense of relief.
Glad I caught the son of a bitch. Now my mom can rest in peace. Come across TV, you know. I said, somebody's right there. Come on, Mom. How did I know? Unless I remembered what he looked like. It kills me now, every day.
It was very, very tense time. I didn't know how to feel. I wanted revenge. I wanted to get my hands on this guy.
Rader tells us he had most of what he called the mother lode of evidence in a two-drawer file cabinet located in his compliance office at Park City. When we were there, it was unlocked. There was a key to lock it up on top, but it wasn't locked. So he was pretty comfortable, I guess, that it was safe there. He had everything categorized, indexed, and they're in order. Kept all the originals of any correspondence, of all the artifacts that he was collecting. He would mark them with dates and times. The level of organization was remarkable.
At this time, I'm going to ask, how do you plead to these 10 counts?
Guilty.
All right, are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Rader, I need to find out more information.
Well, I mean, I strangled Mrs. Otero.
He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. The death penalty for his cases was not on the books. And so we really never had a discussion about the death penalty being possible. He was fully aware that he was never going to see freedom again.
I think that we in the media and in the community really fully understood the damage he had done when you could feel that sense of relief that he was off the street forever.
In the courtroom, families of some of BTK's victims got their first real look at the man police believe killed their loved ones.
This changed these young people's lives 30, 25 years ago, and they've lived with that ever since.
The criminal actions of Dennis Rader caused irreparable damage to the very fabric of my blood family. He caused me to challenge my faith, change my future forever. Yet I have never allowed his actions to send me to the dark side.
Nancy Fox is my sister. Nancy's death is like a deep wound that will never, ever heal.
I'd just like for him to suffer for the rest of his life.
I'm Jeffrey Davis, son of Dolores Davis. For the last 5,326 days, I have wondered what it would be like to confront the walking cesspool that took my mother's precious life.
Not only were we united as a family of survivors, we were kind of representative of the family of citizens of the community who had literally lived in terror at times.
You have to live with the cold reality that while all of us here will overcome your depravity, you have now lost everything, and you will forever remain nothing.
His wife requested an emergency divorce, and I think it's probably the quickest divorce in history. It's probably less than 5 minutes. I don't think she's ever looked back. I don't think she enjoys being in the public. She's never been interviewed.
Paul and the kids became Dennis's victims. I can't imagine the price that they paid. My heart, I can't imagine.
This is now Dennis Rader, no longer in a courtroom suit, but a prison uniform. This is likely the last time you'll ever see the serial killer again.
Pretty soon I'll be a black hole. I won't be here. I'll be gone. I've accumulated a lot of deaths, a lot of hurt and shame on my family and everything, and it's kind of like things have been sucked into me, or I'm basically in a black hole.
One of the things I suspected about Rader, there were things different about him than the typical things we know about serial killers. The fact that he was a family man, had a full-time job, seemed to be a regular guy with an ordinary childhood. It impressed upon me the importance of studying people who don't fit the mold, who break the stereotypes. We need to be very clear that there are no formulas, because I think had we been like that back then, Rader would have been caught sooner. I think it's an irony that everything about Rader is control, and yet he's in a prison cell 24/7 with guards deciding when he gets his meds and his food and gets to have a shower, etc. He's totally under our control. And it's important that we learn from people like Rader by demystifying them, decoding them, and unmasking them. Even though my work with Rader is finished, my research of extreme offenders and how to prevent them continues.